I think we should define ourselves with the kinds of questions we're interested in. So just remember what you don't want to do, and you'll be on the right path. You can ask a question literally on the surface and very quickly find something that just we have absolutely no idea about. And this is what I find fascinating, is our distinctions of mathematics, physics, biology, and chemistry are so false in some sense. A question doesn't care whether you are a subject of physics, if you are interested or a pupil of biology, a question doesn't care.
Yeah.
And this is sort of the one thing that I have to teach myself every time I'm thinking that although you might have an expertise or interest in one field, you will have to jump to think about other fields if you truly care about a question.
I can also imagine a home environment, parents and all that, which is also perhaps playing a big role.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. I grew up in a rural setting with very little, sometimes, supervision, and I didn't feel someone was watching me all the time. I had to finish my homework and all that good stuff, and everybody has to just make sure that you are conforming to the sets of things that are necessary to proceed in a much more traditional academic environment. But beyond that, I would spend 10, 12 hours sometimes outside the house, many days. And I think, yeah, my parents and especially my grandfather, who was a teacher himself, and then all of his 6 daughters are teachers. And there was this kind of a sense of, it is okay to explore. And one of the things that I found often in that home environment was, there's a sense of adventure in learning.
Yeah.
And if that sense of adventure is stripped away, you are left with almost something that feels like an unsurmountable mountain. I mean, a mountain is an adventure.
Right.
But if you remove the spirit of adventure in climbing a mountain, what is left in education? Then it really is just a mountain.
Yeah.
And it feels daunting. It feels scary.
Yeah.
And I've always felt education should be about an adventure.
Right.
And I think even today, I find myself in many places in doing science where it feels like an adventure. Literally, either my hands are trembling with excitement, sometimes fear. I am at places, in the middle of the ocean, dead at night, absolutely dark. And I'm thinking, what am I doing here? Trying to collect some plankton in the ocean. And it just, but sometimes that same sense of adventure lies in late at night, looking through a microscope where you might be the only person to have looked at this phenomena or this object for the first time.
Right.
And I feel school, and especially informal education, should really be around the sense of adventure.
Do you remember any particular question that you got obsessed with when you were a student? Any recollection?
I remember one day thinking about this idea of skeletons and realizing that rabbits have as many bones as humans. And I just didn't believe that could be true. I think I felt, wait a second, rabbits, I've seen rabbits around. How is it possible? I mean, they can't be as complex as us or something. And I was quite obsessed by this idea of comparing. And I actually ended up going to some butcher shops where rabbit meat was sold and pleading to the butcher to give me all the bones. And it was not a very, you can see this this is quite a involved experiment. And I actually cleaned all the bones And it turned out there's roughly around 210 or so bones. So there was no big aha moment or no, it was a very general, very day to day process. But in the end, when I did finish that skeleton, I still remember, that moment has stayed with me. I
Yeah.
convinced myself that yes, you need 200 bones to build a rabbit.
Would you just say you're a scientist, or how, when somebody asks you, what do you say? Are you a biologist?
I think we should define ourselves with the kinds of questions we're interested in
Okay, that's a very
answering rather than what skills we have.
okay.
Because skills of a scientist, and especially as all of us are learning as we go along, I would argue that is quite malleable. If you get passionate about a question, that dramatically changes and you learn, but your perspective matters quite a lot. So I think, I define myself most often as, I'm a naturalist. I care deeply about how nature is organized in some sense. But to me, of course, there are a certain class of tools that I'm more comfortable with that I'll think about in that setting. But I'm equally excited about what I don't know or the kinds of skills that I need to acquire to answer those questions.
Yeah, what kind of questions is Professor Manu Prakash really curious about and interested in?
I follow my nose. And this might sound strange or often enough we make observations that we just cannot explain, and you file them in the back of your head, and you keep, after some time those sets of questions keep coming back at you over and over again, and at some point of time you really have to give in into that temptation. It's almost like, as scientists, we are at a candy store. There are so many open questions. It's almost overwhelming what we should do or care about. But you have to listen to your heart. I often think about this, that an intuition plays an incredibly important role. There might be a question that I am quite passionate about that somebody else might not care about.
Right.
And similarly, there might be a question that somebody else is really passionate about that I don't find interesting.
Yeah.
And it's perfectly okay. Just like art, there is a class or genre of art or music that you might like that somebody else just doesn't care about.
Right.
It really is a personal question. And I think for me, it's always been a taste that it changes over time. And I mature in my own thinking. And again, I think especially the trainees, when you're starting a career in science, you really have to follow your nose.
What would be, let's say, two or three questions if you were to, at this point in your age and career, if you were to say that's Manu Prakash, what would those questions are they representative questions you can tell us?
There is a very broad range of questions, and there is some very practical things that I'm excited about. Starting with the broadest perspective, I'm very interested in trying to understand how life embodies computation. How do living systems compute and compute in a very traditional sense of building structures, being able to decipher the world around them, from a context of perception, but perception really almost at a single cell level. I often think about, do cells think? What does it mean to define thinking at a cellular context, for example? There is, over the last 5 years, I've been more and more thinking about the ocean. It's been fascinating to look at many of these questions that I just described, but in an evolutionary perspective. We know and understand that life evolved in the ocean, but we know very little about life in the ocean. And I find this challenge quite fascinating of how do we really think to study these systems that are so far remote that can never be brought into the lab, but hold the secrets of some of the most fundamental things. I mean, one of the questions that we've been thinking about as a lab for almost 10 years now is, where did the neuron come from? We have all studied a neuron. We have all thought about the brain quite deeply. All of us no matter what, we use our brain every day, we're dependent on it. Beautiful science has been done, but where did the brain come from?
Yep.
What was a precursor of an animal that did not have a brain or did not have a nervous system? And I think most interestingly and most recently, we've been thinking about animals that did not have neurons at all.
Right.
And with that respect, we have been working on for almost a decade now animals that still don't have neurons, but still have complex behavior. So, how would you think about how do you do and achieve the daily life of going around, finding food, avoiding predators when you do not really have a traditional nervous system?
Right.
Um, and I think in these sets of questions, whenever I think about this and I ask myself, there is always a species that's out there. There is 9 to 10 million species out there. We've studied extensively maybe 10, maybe 15 of them. And I often think about for every question that any of us is thinking about, there is a right organism or a right system or a right living thing that just we have not uncovered as yet.
Yep.
Either it's just described. And this is also where I started thinking about what if scientific tools were accessible to everyone?
Yep. Yep.
Then while we have 10 million species, we might also have 10 million curious souls exploring every one of them because they all hold a certain secret, and the diversity of life needs to be celebrated. And that actually really led us to think hard about how do we share the kinds of scientific tools that allow us to answer these questions as broadly as possible.
Right.
Because in that breadth lies almost a question in meta science,
Okay.
which is, what does it mean to be a scientist? And how can we enable a much larger group of people to engage in this journey and joy of exploration?
Right.
And I think this has been a big endeavor of ours to really make sure that we can share some of these scientific tools.
Okay.
So people get to explore their own questions.
Right. Beautiful. I mean, really a nice set of questions. I just want to pick on the first one that you mentioned, which is how life embodies computation. Now, for someone, I'm just going to think from a school student's point of view. Computation is usually associated with computers, and there's some image that I have, and you have life has another image. How do you even, it's somehow not this particular question. Is it possible to shed some light on what this means?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fascinating space of ideas, and I think, of course, this has been at the heart of biology in some sense. If you truly think about biology, is really from a context of information processing, it's a remarkable system how an organism can arise from a single cell. Where is that information stored? I have 5 fingers, and I have a mirror symmetry in these 2 hands. I also have 2 hands that are equal in size. Something must have figured out how to make equal hands and kept a balance between these two. I mean, these two parts, when they were growing, were quite far from each other. And again, very simple question, literally right in front of our eyes. I don't think we can answer this right now. How could these two parts talk to each other in a manner that one of them is not bigger? There has to be a context of something was measuring the size of this hand and controlling it in a manner to make sure one of them is not twice as large. It actually turns out there are other organisms that do have one hand twice as large. There are crabs out there that can grow one hand to be twice as large, so they break that symmetry. You can ask almost any fundamental question in biology in the context of where is the information stored, how is it processed, and I often think about this as computer science is a very small portion of what the entire field of computation has to offer to us.
Okay.
Computer science and how you and I are talking to each other in a realization of a device is only a very practical but very narrow implementation of what computation truly means as an idea. So our perception is just one useful machine, while there are millions of other instantiation of this idea that literally are around us, that we are just starting to grapple. And of course, neuroscience has been one field where this idea has really been thought about in great detail, sometimes to its own detriment. Sometimes when we ask, oh, is brain a computer? You
Yeah.
might start thinking about traditional computers and forget that the brain is a very different kind of a computer, and maybe that analogy is not good. And
Okay.
so sometimes in these analogies, we make mistakes. We
Yes.
get led into a path that we was quite narrow.
Yes.
And I think I would think about almost all fundamental questions in biology of structure and function can be thought about in the language of information processing.
Okay.
And I find that fascinating because, again, very mathematical ideas in information processing might have a big role to play in unraveling mysteries in biology, and
Right.
especially the kind of mathematical languages that we might not have even developed.
Yeah.
Maybe it might be useful for mathematics in general,
Yeah.
uh, to develop those kinds of languages.
Now, just connecting this to the Indian context, our schooling system, and we have all gone through this, emphasizes a whole lot on the thinking part and much less so on the doing part. Do you have any suggestions for the student listeners or perhaps even teachers on the implication of what we are saying?
Yeah, I think, um, I mean, I grew up in India and I have very fond memories of my schools, but most of my memories, the most joyful of my memories, are just times tinkering around outside the classroom. And this idea that as a scientist there are certain kind of superpowers that you have to perfect. One of the superpowers is the power to observe.
Yeah.
If you can learn to observe what's happening around you acutely, you both develop a sense of what you don't understand, but also what good questions are.
Yeah.
And so I think, thinking versus doing, sometimes I can sit on a chair and think as much as I want, and I cannot resolve a problem. And I could spend 20 minutes on a microscope and just watch
Yeah.
and observe. And that act of doing and being unbiased about the phenomena that you're interested in and paying attention is something that I feel we need to share. And it's only by practice that you develop that kind of an intuition, in a sense.
Right.
I mean, I wish we were spending more and more time observing our surroundings as a way to learn.
Right.
I mean, it has nothing to do with biology per se or life sciences. You can do this in
Right.
any subject that you care about. Um, and in the act, I mean, I still bear scars on my hands and my appendages of my observations and my doing as a child. And those sets of moments, although were scary at times, they taught me lessons that I would not learn in a book.
Yeah.
And those are the kinds of lessons that stay along. Another way of thinking about this would be is when you get obsessed with a question, you will find the kind of knowledge that you do need to learn and the background that you need to pick up. But
Right.
unless you're obsessed with a question, unless you're obsessed with a way of thinking about these sets of ideas, it's very difficult to be able to be passionate about that background.
Now, one of the questions which I wanted to ask you was about, you studied computer science at IIT, and most of us would know what students who do that do, and you turned to biology, over a period. How did that happen?
Uh, I think, it really is my scientific career and my life in general has been a series of accidents. Uh, I I remember I wanted to be I wanted to join the Air Force when I grew up as a high school student. Who doesn't want to join the Air Force? You watch these beautiful machines, they can fly, and it turned out my dad said no, and I was quite sad about it. But then on the other hand, uh, engineering was still my passion. I actually joined mechanical engineering. And early on, of course, and especially in the Indian undergraduate system, you have to declare what you want to be, which makes absolutely no sense to me. How do I know what I want to be? And after a year or so, some of my mentors advised, oh, there's also this other discipline in computer science. Maybe you should try that out. And I did try that out. And I switched to computer science. I got a degree in computer science, but I explicitly remember the day of my graduation, I was thinking about it quite a lot. And it was very clear to me what I did not want to do.
Okay.
It was not clear to me. It's never clear to me what I want to do, but it's always clear to me what I don't want to do. And I think I found that as a good balancing ground or a compass for myself. I did not want to sit in front of a computer all day.
Yeah.
And still today, I make sure that I don't sit across, although I have many academic and duties on my shoulders, but I still make sure that I don't sit on a computer. Just that's not what I want to do.
Yeah.
There's nothing against it. I love the conceptual ideas of computation, and actually it's not an accident that I think about computational context in biology. But then when I did my PhD, I started thinking about computer science in a much more broader and a much more general sense. And my PhD really was about, could fluids compute? I found fluids fascinating. In your kitchen sink, you can do hundreds of experiments. It was an object that just did almost magic sometimes in front of you. And I spent 6 years thinking about, can fluids compute? And I actually ended up building a computer using water and air bubbles. And that was a very satisfying experience because for the first time, I was able to take a really conceptual and an abstract idea that I had absolutely no reason to believe early on it would work, and go full circle to conceptually understand the depth of that question and literally build one to demonstrate. And I think once an experience like that happens in a life of a scientist, you realize you have the capacity to take a conceptual idea and go all the way through it and dedicate the time and effort. And it's a very important moment and a feeling in life. And I think post that, I returned back to my sort of roots, is one way of thinking about it, which is just the natural world. Yeah. I had so much fun being in the natural world as a child. But of course, I did not understand at that time how deeply connected many of the ideas in physics and mathematics and chemistry are to biology. I now better understand that all of these cannot be separated. Yeah. And I think from that day onward, I started thinking about much more biological questions.
Yes, I really appreciate your dedication and cause. Manuji, one question which I know the answer, but I still want to poke you is, do you ever fear that you will run out of ideas?
The nature that we are part of has woven a web around us in such a way that, it's almost to a sense that every question you answer leads to more questions. Okay. And if you're honest about it, there is always more to explore. Okay. And that journey is really why we do science to begin with. Right. Yes, once a while we end up really solving a riddle that has bothered many people for a while, and we all, pat on our backs often enough. But I've always felt that the power to observe is almost, the more you know, the more you have that power in some sense, and that cyclic kind of an iterative nature. Yeah. Now the analogy to that would be a fractal. Yeah. Questions are organized in a sense of a fractal. Okay. The more you observe, the more of them appear right in front of you. Yeah. And they're as beautiful as the first question. Yeah. But you really have to be original to look at a new part of a fractal. Yeah. And I think that is really what is hard to begin with. I don't try to put value on my ideas in many ways. It's for the world to decide what we do is meaningful or not. You really have to do what you're passionate about. Yeah. And when that happens, you are not working on ideas or questions that other people care about. You're working on ideas that you care about. And almost a journey in science is as much about exploring the world as about exploring your inner self. There is a very typical set of ideas that you will be passionate about based on what you did in your life, what you grew up, what you have seen, what you're passionate about, what you have empathy for.
Right.
Uh, who do you talk to? Who do you share these ideas? I mean, most often, the most exciting thing about ideas is the moment I have a new idea, even if I might not be sure whether it's true or not, I want to share it. I want to talk to my colleagues, my students about it. And in those conversations, many of these questions develop and take life of its own that I was not initially intending to.
Right.
So, I think it's almost as we're stuck in a web of questions,
Yeah.
and I'm not worried about falling out of that web.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Very nice. And you're also suggesting that science is also about conversations and finding channels and finding meaningful, questions from that.
Absolutely. I think conversations is really a fundamental, and, at a human level, those conversations is what we as scientists live by. And frankly, the pandemic will have a deep impact on science. And I mean, of course, there are certain sets of things that happen very quickly, but the kind of science discourse that was happening every day has been hampered. And we will learn and think about it. But conversations, and especially conversations with the people you trust.
Right.
There is a sense of judgment in science that you are right or you are wrong, and it's good for science to move forward. That's good, but for a development of a scientist, that judgment should come in from trusted partners, should come in from ways that people are trying to critique your work in a manner that's trying to improve it, or even share what they might have thought without imposing their own opinions or solutions on the problem that you're passionate about. So I feel much of, the burnout feeling that you have in science comes from this fear of judgment.
Yeah.
But once you let that go, you know, you're not working alone,
Yeah.
but the reason you do science is for yourself. There has to be a inner curiosity that you're trying to, and if that fits the bill, then it's okay.
Yeah.
So I think I often feel you have to keep that judgment, although it's important for the progress of science. Uh, you have to really have a trusted group of friends and scientific colleagues that you can have those conversations with.
And maybe to translate this into a classroom context, maybe we need to find ways where we ask students to talk to each other rather than not talking to each other.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And frankly, that would be a revolution in a classroom, because I remember I was told to sit quietly in a classroom. I had a lot of trouble sitting quietly in a classroom.
Right.
And I remember spending a lot of time outside the classroom for that reason, because I wanted to talk.
Yeah.
And, but, if we could do that in education, that would truly be a revolution.
Right. Do you have any message for our young listeners?
The real message I have for all the young listeners, and especially students, the younger you are, the better. Preserve your sense of curiosity and, the sense of adventure, because that is what's going to help longer term in it's not even about scientific career for that matter. It really is about a life lesson that somehow that joy of learning is really what we are gifted with. And hold on to it, no matter what people say, no matter what your grades are. You would be surprised to know what my grades were in high school and undergrad. They're not that great, but I spent a lot of time exploring, and I think I valued it, even if my peers and sometimes my parents and sometimes my teachers didn't value it, uh, because I knew what I didn't want to do. So just remember what you don't want to do, and you'll be on the right path.
Thank you so much, Manuji. It was a pleasure.
No, it's such a pleasure. Thank you so much. I wish I could be with some of the students. I think it would have been so much more fun to talk to them. But I'm hoping to chat again and, also learn from some of the students and what they think of what we've been talking about.